answer this by what you're telling him, what combination of these medicines might be most helpful for you. The psychiatrist, that's all he does. So he's better at mixing a combination of these drugs that might really, really help. It might be a real mercy and a blessing. So start by asking a doctor, and here are some further guidelines to think about when deciding, would medication be a good thing for me or for this loved one that I care for. When their experience of depression is severe, by all means, that may be a very good indicator. When depression persists for a prolonged period of time, like weeks, months, when depression does not seem to improve even while engaging in counseling. So I think that's helpful too. If you see the loved one is going and they're really trying, they're listening, they're showing up for their counseling appointments, they're listening, they come back and they can tell you a little bit about what they talked about and about what they did and about what that counseling person is suggesting and offering to help. If they do all of that and you still see little or no improvement, it continues to be persistent depression or any of the other kinds of diagnoses are persistently severe, then that's a good time to say, probably let's try and see if medication would help. Probably it will help. It may not, but that's definitely a good time to choose to do that. So that's what we know, okay, from the medical side of things, from looking at these kind of problems, from medical science sort of perspective. Those are things we know. Now here are some more things that we know, and it's not only from that perspective, it's just from a pastoral, from a Christian, from a believing worldview type of perspective. And I'm going to read just a couple of little quotes to you from some different people who have experienced depression and know a lot about it. You would have heard of Charles Spurgeon, famous Baptist preacher in London, right? Last century before last, very well known. This is what he writes. Now he has he wrote in 1875 these lectures to his students. He had this pastor's college where he would teach people who wanted to be pastors, preachers. He would teach them, and those lectures were published in 1875. And I got that book in 1983 or 4, right after we got married and right when we were sensing a real call to ministry. I stumbled on that book and bought it. And one of the lectures, the entire lecture, is called The Minister's Fainting Fits. The Minister's Fainting Fits. And that just stuck with me, and I always remembered that's in that book. I read it. I go back there and look at it occasionally. And so I went back and I thought, well, let's talk about depression as kind of an example. And when we talk about depression, let's go back and listen again to what Spurgeon said. This is what he's saying about the minister's fainting fits. He's talking about depression. And he says, this evil will also come upon us. We know not why. And then it is all the more difficult to drive it away. Causeless depression is not to be reasoned with. So here he is. He's a pastor. He's a teacher at the pastor's college in London. And he's saying this evil will come on us, and we don't know why. And causeless depression, a depression we have no clue why we feel that way. Causeless depression is not to be reasoned with, nor can David's harp charm it away by sweet discoursings. As well fight with the mist as with this shapeless, undefinable, yet all-beclouding hopelessness. Now that was 1875. 2016, the Harvard doctor said not exactly this, but he couldn't tell you a whole lot more about causeless. He's saying there are billions of nerve things going on. There are many, many causes. There's hereditary, there's temperament, there's worldview, there's medications, there's physical body illness. All these things can be a part of the cause why all of a sudden someone just realizes they're really depressed. They're really sad. Spurgeon in 1875 knew about this, and he wrote exactly the same. And honestly, he was a preacher, so he was good with words, but this is a much better description than that DSM thing I read to you. It's much more accurate, I think. I mean, it's not terribly different in the symptoms, but this is a really good explanation. And he's admitting that as we might as well be fighting with the mist as with this shapeless, undefinable, yet all-beclouding hopelessness. Now listen to this. If those who laugh at such melancholy did but feel the grief of it for 1 hour, their laughter would be sobered into compassion. Now that's what we started out in this session, just kind of going back to. I mentioned that during the break, someone said, they had seen people just kind of say, oh, well, if your relationship with the Lord were what it's supposed to be, you wouldn't have this struggle. That's kind of what Spurgeon is saying here. People that just laugh of it or make little of it or think there's nothing to it, if they themselves did but feel that melancholy, the grief of it for 1 hour, their laughter would be sobered into compassion. And that's certainly true. That's what we want to be, is have that compassion. So resolution might perhaps shake it off. But where are we to find the resolution when the whole man is unstrung? That's Spurgeon again. The iron bolt which so mysteriously fastens the door of hope and holds our spirits in gloomy prison needs a heavenly hand to push it back. And when that hand is seen, we cry with the apostle, blessed be God, even the Father of mercies and the God of all comfort, who comforts us in all our afflictions. And then later, in 1964, in a book that was published by a preacher also in London, Martin Lloyd-Jones, published a book. They actually titled it Spiritual Depression, and he talks through some of these same kinds of things where he sees people that kind of want to impatiently just brush it aside and say that a Christian is one who sings all the day long, and that ever since they've been converted has always been their story. There's never a ripple on the surface of the soul, and all has been well. Since they do not recognize the condition at all, they have grave doubts as to those who say they're depressed. He's saying the same kind of thing that he knew then in the 60s in London, people that kind of took that view of like, oh, that's silly, just pull yourself up by your bootstraps. You'll be all right. You can do it. Not true. J.I. Packer is another one, and I remembered this. I bought this book, which you should read if you haven't. It's called Knowing God. J.I. Packer is written in 1973, and I got that as a young Christian, and I'm thankful that I did, but I remember burned into my mind a chapter called These Inward Trials. Stuff going on inside. Some of the stuff we've been talking about. Those are these inward trials. He saw the same thing. He said there's a certain type of ministry of the gospel that is cruel. There's a certain type of ministry of the gospel that is cruel. Basically, it describes a type of gospel ministry that gives people the idea that we just don't struggle with certain problems anymore because we're Christians. He saw that in 73 and wrote about it. Very important to know that is a cruel application of the gospel, to act like none of these struggles are anything real, like there's nothing to that. It should drive us instead to compassion. Grace is God drawing us sinners closer to himself. And how does God in grace bring this about? Not by shielding us from assault by the world, the flesh, and the devil, nor by protecting us from burdensome and frustrating circumstances, nor yet by shielding us from the troubles created by our own temperament and psychology, but rather by exposing us to all these things, so as to overwhelm us with a sense of our own inadequacy and to drive us to cling to him more closely. This is the ultimate reason, from our standpoint, why God fills our lives with troubles and perplexities of one sort or another. It is to ensure that we shall learn to hold fast to him. What's God's perspective on this stuff? What's he up to with this? That's what he's up to. And so I think even in this, you can see a really, really helpful perspective on these very kind of struggles that we're talking about this weekend with addictions and mental health struggles. Now, I think it was like 2 or 3 years ago, maybe 2014, there was a conference. I can't remember. It might have been one that Randall went to. It might have been a Together for the Gospel conference, or it might have been a Gospel Coalition. I don't remember. But they interviewed Piper and MacArthur. Okay? And you can, if you want this, ask me and I'll give it to you. It'll even take you to the very minute in the video and you can watch and you can hear what I'm about to tell you. But basically, the person asking the questions in the interview asked the two of these guys, John Piper, pastor of Bethlehem Church in Minnesota or whatever, and John MacArthur, Grace Church in California, about discouragement in ministry. That's the question, okay? How do you handle discouragement in ministry? Something like that. So MacArthur gets to go first. And he pauses for a minute, and he just says, well, I'm just not really built that way. I just don't really have discouragement. I'm just too busy. I've got too many things to do. I just move on to the next thing. I just am not, that's not me. That's his response. Piper, on the other hand, John Piper, he smiles and he listens and nods. And he talks to MacArthur, and he has a few things, I think, that MacArthur needed to hear. And Piper told him, and among other things, in a very kind way, he said, when Piper was about 40, he was offered to go out in California and stay in these people's home while they themselves were gone on vacation. So he and his wife, Noelle, went, and they were staying in that house for a week on a little vacation, just the two of them. And the second or third day they were there, he was sitting out on the front steps of the little house that they were staying in, and he was just crying. He was sitting there with his face in his hands on his knees, crying. And he said, I didn't have a clue why. And his wife came out and asked, and he said, I just don't know. I'm just so sad. This is John Piper, okay? Bethlehem Baptist, very influential and powerful, used of God preacher today, right now. He was crying, and he said he was so sad, and that sadness lasted for years. And MacArthur looks at him, years? And years. Now, that to me was a really helpful and eye-opening view. Which is your, honestly, just be honest. You don't have to tell me or raise your hand. Just be honest. When you think about these struggles that we've described or that you've seen in other people, which is it? Is it, seriously? Come on. Or is it an honest soul who himself has struggled and he knows what it's like, and he said, that sadness went on for years and I have no idea why. I never knew why. It finally lifted. It went away. But I don't know why it was. This is where I hope that you'll want to sit, because this is the side or the seat of compassionate care and concern for people's struggles. And that you can hear a story like what Lynn told you, and your heart can cry to the Lord, Lord, help. Lord, have mercy. Lord, please move. Please help in this. Now, I'm not saying this to bash MacArthur at all. I'm just telling you this is a very clear sample that you can watch on the internet when you go home today and see two really different perspectives. And in this case, it's more because one of them had really suffered with this stuff and one never had. He didn't know what it was even like. And that's not his fault. That's not what God had for him. But if we're kind of more over here, we need to be open to the reality that there really is something to these struggles going on. It's not just people blowing smoke. It's not just people trying to make an excuse to get by with bad behavior. There's more to it than that. So, what do we know about depression? What can we say we actually know about it? Well, it can be a very complex condition. We know that. We just learned that from Mayo Clinic and from Harvard. There's no blood panel and no other test to diagnose depression like we would for cancer or some other serious